used to all of the different variations that are out there. But I do appreciate really the invitation, as always. The league and the Registrar of Voters Office has really always been a really tight-knit, close-knit group of individuals, and our partnership has only gotten stronger over the years. And I do appreciate everything that you said, Anne. And it's become such a vital collaboration with one another that and strong one that I do believe that, you know, we need to stay close with one another, particularly at this time when it's so much more important. I thought March was important to get the information out, but it's going to be so much more important to get the information out for this upcoming election and all the work that we've been doing. And let me just say that the Registrar of Voters Office really has not caught a break. We've been pulling probably longer hours, if not, you know, overall longer hours since the March election than we ever did for the March election, as we're preparing for the November election. And the reason why is because of the pandemic and how are we going to be able to conduct the election. And I think that's a lot of the questions that many of you will have as we go through this presentation. So let me go ahead and go straight into the kind of where we're at in terms of our preparations and of all the conversations. And I do appreciate, Anne, some delay. I know that there was a lot of questions out at the very front, and I asked to kind of move this later on into July timeframe to really have this presentation, because any earlier, even a couple of weeks ago, would have kind of changed the dynamics of what we know and all the conversations that we've been having with the state, certainly with the legislature and the governors and the Secretary of State's office on how this election is going to be conducted. And really at the time that you had originally reached out, a lot of it was still in flux. We really didn't know how we were going to be able to conduct the election. And it still continues to evolve as we're now making the final details and working through the respective details. And there's been a lot of it to be had. So everything that I'm going to be talking with you today is really high-level summary of how we're approaching the November election. Okay. So overall, let me just say that, as you can see here, our message is going to be revolving around this logo. This is our logo that we're going to be pushing, that voters will see, and whether it's the league or any other interested organization or political party that wants to use it, please, the more uniformity and consistent our message is, it will ultimately reach our respective goals, which ultimately is to how do we balance election integrity, transparency, accuracy, security, now with this other new element of safety and having a healthy environment for all registered voters within San Diego. We've always been able to conduct the election kind of to a specific cookie cutter degree of traditional polling places. That's what voters know. And now we're having to really make a lot of changes associated with it. But ultimately the element here is how do we balance all the respective universes that are out there. And as you can see from our new logo, for voters to vote safer throughout the entire county, and that's as a result of the governor's executive order to send everyone a mail ballot, and we're asking voters to be safe and to do so by mail. And that's ultimately the awareness level that we need to really project out, and we will be launching into that, as I will be discussing later on in a couple of slides about how the pandemic has ultimately changed our universe and what voters can expect and what changes they should anticipate as we move forward, now that we're 112 days away from the election, today being the 112th day. Yesterday, by the way, I should mention, was the first day of candidate filing for cities and ourselves for all the other respective offices that did not show up during the March election. So we anticipate that 600 to 700 individuals will file for office. We will ultimately see our candidate filing process is entirely changed, where now it's by an appointment process. Normally people had the ability to just float into the office, open up the doors and come to the office. Now our lobby is closed, and candidates who want to file need to make an appointment with our campaign and candidate services section. And then a big element to this, of course, as I mentioned before, is a sit down and presentations like this, which we will continue having and do it more often, and we'll initiate it as opposed to League of Women Voters. We plan on initiating our own set and series of presentations to inform the public as well as many interested organizations and political parties and advocacy groups about what we're planning on as we march towards the election. So a big effort will be around communications, voter outreach, and communications in formats like this. And since many of our used to be, on-site grassroots going to respective meetings is no longer possible as a result of the limitations that we have as a result of the pandemic itself. Okay, so really, if we boil down the pandemic and COVID-19, what does it boil down to in the impact as it relates to the impact for our office? The state really recognized that as soon as the March election day was over, we started seeing the spikes going on and it happening across the entire country. And we immediately went into, after certifying the election, because we were here, even though the state had closed down, county had closed down many of the government offices, our office was still working to certify the election, but also remains to working here at the office because we still are processing registration forms and petitions for the November election or a future election. And so our office, as well as the personnel and its activities, are considered an essential activities in the eyes of federal laws and state laws. And so when they talk about essential workers, we are considered essential workers as well as an essential entity. So when the pandemic occurred, when the posturing was occurring to close down, the Secretary of State's office created a task force, invited San Diego, myself, to participate in that task force, along with many other elections officials and other organizations, to start thinking through how November's election is going to be conducted. And there were varying viewpoints. Let me just say that there was a lot of opinions going back and forth as to how the election should be conducted and whether or not there should be in-person voting locations or should it be all mail ballots because of the pandemic to limit that the spread of the pandemic and potential deaths associated with it as well. So when it comes down to the overall impact of the election, there was, for the most part, two aspects of it that needed to be considered. Number one was how to conduct in-person voting when our volunteer poll worker population, many of them are within the 65 and on higher group, which is also part of the pandemic, the high risk population as well. And then second to that is how do you conduct an election when many of the polling locations are small in terms of space, and the pandemic and public health officials have said 6 feet of space, social distancing is required. And how do you conduct that with no level of certainty of the use of many locations, particularly the private locations? And so when we looked at San Diego's poll worker population, for example, you see here, this was the total number of poll workers that served by percentage in their respective age group in the March 2020 presidential primary election. As you can see there, 30% of all of our poll workers were in the 65 plus high risk population. And then if you consider the 60 to 64 age population as well, that would raise it to a total of 41% of the total numbers that served in the March election. That is pretty darn high, that 30%. A third of our population, just the 65 and plus, are in this high risk population. And how do we overcome a situation like that when poll workers in this age group are asked to stay at home? Certainly for our office, we had a number of folks that are 65 plus in age, and we acted to move them to telecommute and remotely work from home immediately. They were our first group of individuals. Now, how does that occur when you're talking about a population, a volunteer population to the tune of 8,000 to 9,000, and 30% of that are in this high risk population? And whether or not they would be available, but who wouldn't be available, it created this level of uncertainty. And and as you know, elections are all about certainty. We need to know how an election is going to occur for ourselves so we can plan accordingly, but also how do we inform the public adequately, giving us and them sufficient time, everyone sufficient time to prepare on how to either go to a polling place, or that the fact that they're going to mail ballot, or that they're going to serve come election day. So this area created a level of uncertainty for us, and we needed to make sure that we address that aspect. Let me just talk now with kind of the high level of the polling place impacts. When you're talking about using residence addresses or pizza parlors or funeral homes or pet care locations, and so on and so forth, for all these different in restaurants and private facilities, how are these locations going to create certainty for us to be able to use them where they have in the past, or it may not be able to fit the model any longer because the location and the space being made available is too small for social distancing or physical distancing. And so we took a look at that as to what we used for the March election. As you can see here, 31% are public facilities, and then over 1,000 locations, or 69%, are private facilities. And so for us, we needed to make sure that we were considering certain factors as we're looking towards November's election. Number one, again, there's this level of certainty. If private facilities are going to not be able to make themselves available for voting purposes, either because of the pandemic or because they're needing to close down as a result of the pandemic, what locations can we use that will ensure confidence that we can be 100% sure that when we launch into informing the public that these locations are set in stone for us, as opposed to the location being pulled under the rug pulled underneath us, and then thus the voters, like what we saw in primaries in other states and counties throughout the country, like the state of Georgia or Wisconsin. So the good thing is we didn't have to really face the impacts of the pandemic for the March election, and it really gave us time. It is giving us some time, I wouldn't say a lot of time, to pivot and identify where these locations are. Certainly more time than what states and other counties throughout the entire country had for their respective primaries, but certainly not enough time to pivot for any type of election, because as you may know, it takes years in the making to prepare for an election that we're going to be having for November. So confidence of availability and the use of the respective location was key for us in identifying this. And so public facilities for us is a key component. As you can see here, we had 485 locations that were public facilities. And then of course we are needed to narrow that number down to figure out how many of these respective locations have sufficient space to conduct in-person voting. And so at minimum, the size of locations that we're looking at is no less than 2,000 square feet in space, essentially the size of a gymnasium or a cafeteria that is out there, or a conference room area type of location. Other factors that for San Diego County, because we are such large in geography that we have to consider this urban versus rural unincorporated format, because if we're citing these respective locations, then we need to make sure that we're evenly distributing it out to where the population bases and densities are. And certainly accessibility is a component of there. And when I say accessibility, I'm talking about it in all formats, whether it's not just accessibility for people with disabilities, but just in transportation corridors and everything else that we have to take a look at. So there is if you will, an ease of getting to the respective location, or an identification of where these respective locations are going to be. And then finally, there's some elections administrative considerations that we need to make as we're thinking through the November election. And that includes the total number of ballot types that we're going to have in the upcoming election. We're anticipating that we're going to have about 700 ballot types. We don't know yet what that number is, and the reason why is because, as I mentioned, candidate filing has just begun. We don't know all the political jurisdictions that will, and contests that will ultimately land onto the November ballot until closer to the August 7th timeframe, which is 88 days prior to the election. So once we know all of the political jurisdiction, all of the contests that will be on the ballot, that will then drive the total number of ballot types that we will ultimately have. But we're having to project forward to anticipate what that number is now, because we cannot wait. There's not enough time in the day to figure that portion of out. So we're projecting right now that there's approximately going to be 700, and so that's an assumption number that we are kind of basing some fundamental decision making on our side to ensure that from a voter perspective, as well as how we're creating structures at the polling place environment, what that may look like. And I will move toward describing that here in a couple of additional slides that you will see. So what has occurred as a result of those two respective impacts? Many of you now know that the governor signed off on 2 executive orders. The first related to requiring every registered voter being mailed a ballot. And so that will occur for this upcoming election. 100% of all registered voters within our county, and I should say active registered voters to qualify it, will be receiving a mail ballot. And there's a difference between active and inactive registered voters based off of a federal law called the National Voter Registration Act. His second executive order then kind of completed the picture, which came essentially a month after the May 8th first executive order, which kind of spells out some options for elections officials to take, and if they do take it, some additional requirements that is going to be pended with that on in-person voting, polling places, that is essentially. And then you have the legislature with Senate Bill 423, which is sponsored or is being authored by, not sponsored, but authored by Senator Umberg, as well as Assembly Bill 860, which is Assembly Member Mark Berman's bill, which kind of dovetails and parallels the executive orders and codifies the executive order. So let me kind of spell a little bit to a kind of a high level of what that those bills do, or the executive order does. So again, codifies that everyone will receive a mail ballot for the upcoming election. There was certainly a lawsuit that came as a result of the executive order, and that pretty much made that lawsuit moot once the legislature signed off on Assembly Bill 860, with Senate Bill 423 still out there. And I just recently saw an amendment that came through late last week that will now work its way through. So Senate Bill 423 is not signed into law yet. The legislature is posturing themselves to wait for any additional maybe clarification that is needed, and kind of holding that one at bay before they will pass it, just to make sure that once they do pass it, that they don't need to go back and do any additional cleanup. Whereas AB 860 has passed and is now signed into law a couple of weeks ago. I think it was June 18th, if my memory serves me correctly. The second executive order, though, allows for this option, which takes into account the 2 impacts that I mentioned to you before that election officials face. And that is to be able to consolidate polling locations more heavily to the tune of 1 for every 10,000 registered voters, as opposed to the traditional polling place makeup, which is generally about a 1 for every 1,000 registered voters. Here, the consolidation of polling places is now a new option, both signed into as an executive order, and then Senate Bill 423 will codify that option for elections officials. And if you do to exercise that option as an election official, then the requirement is that you would allow and open up those respective locations for a 4-day window. This is similar to the satellite location conversation when I presented out for the March election. There are differences between the two, and I will talk about what those differences are. But similarly to the satellite locations, we were open for 4 days for the 4 mega satellite locations that we had, where they were open Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and certainly on election day. So that would be a requirement. And then if you're planning on exercising this option, then you would also have to do mail ballot drop-off locations to the tune of 1 for every 15,000 registered voters. Right now, we have a pretty extensive and robust mail ballot drop-off location program, of course, and many of you have participated and volunteered and worked as a mail ballot drop-off location individual for us. Well, now that's going to be much more expansive because as opposed to 62 sites, we're going to need to have 124 sites across 29 days as opposed to 7 days. So that is going to be a much larger program than we've ever had to do in the past. This is, if you will, and I'll just be clear, I was pretty disappointed that the legislature acted upon doing it for a 29-day period over double the amount of locations because we all know from the data and the stats that really the heavier use, really the spike that we're going to see is going to be the last 7 days as opposed to, you know, the same day or the following day that we send out the mail ballots that are out there. Finally, the Secretary's part of the executive order here is the Secretary of State as well as counties needs to implement an online mail ballot tracking system. So all counties will be implementing either their own or hopping on to the Secretary of State's online mail ballot tracking system. It's called Ballot Tracks. So you'll hear this tagline called "Where's my ballot?" And that's the ability for voters to sign up to track their mail ballot as it's getting to them, as well as when they're returning it back. And so there's technologies around that, and San Diego County is in a pretty strong position there, as well as ultimately sending everyone a mail ballot because, as you know, we've over the years, the voter trend has been that voters are preferring to vote by mail anyhow, and so 75% already receive a mail ballot, so we're really only talking about the remaining 25%. And then, as I mentioned before, SB 423 and AB 860. So what does that look like in a very summarized fashion? So these executive orders, 100% of the voters would receive a mail ballot. There are 3 options on the table for a county election official to exercise. The first is some counties will exercise the same traditional polling place format as they've done before. And the second one is the new option that I just spelled out to all of you. And then the third is the Voters' Choice Act model, which is similar to the model, well, it's the model that counties like Los Angeles, Orange County, Sacramento County, Santa Clara County, you've got Napa out there and Madera County that have acted upon this during either 2018 or their first election was in March of this year, like Los Angeles and Orange County went to this Voters' Choice Act model. And then a voter education campaign is going to be required for the upcoming election. Okay, so what did March's election look like? Well, as I kind of spelled out, we had 75% of the electorate already received a mail ballot for the election because they had signed up to be a permanent mail ballot voter or they were a one-time requester for that specific election. We had 1,548 precincts, which is that 1 for every 1,000 registered voters, and we used a combination of public and private locations that were open for 1 day. The 62 mail ballot drop-off locations for 7 days, and every single voter is assigned to a place, to a polling place during the March election, and then we had this 8 to 9,000 poll worker population that served as a volunteer for us on election day. And then our campaign revolved around the March presidential primary election, which was the party primary election. So that's what our campaign was. It wasn't required, but we did so just because it needed to resonate and be reinforced for all voters to understand what a presidential primary will look like. So, so what are we going to plan on doing for the November election? So we will be taking the option for voters to, we're going to take the option to consolidate more heavily the polling locations and the 1 for every 10,000. But as you can see here, if we have 1.85 million registered voters, 1 for every 10,000 would mean that we would have 184 locations spread throughout the entire county, what we're calling super polls locations. That is after we looked at those various factors that I talked with you about in an earlier slide things like the urban and rural, unincorporated area, things like our election makeup and the structure associated with it, the public facilities that we have that we need to take into consideration. We're going to add actually, and what we're working towards is solidifying 235 polling places out there. So close to about a 30% more locations than what is required as a result of the governor's executive order. So our ratio is going to be along the lines of 1 for 8,000 registered voters. Again, to ensure certainty of use and spacious locations. Our goal is to identify public facilities and public facilities only that have big parking lots, and they will be open for 4 days. Now, that's not to say that we won't look at private locations, because you have other private locations like YMCAs that are out there that may be able to be used. Right now, our focus is really the public facilities, and if we need to move in towards more of a tier plan B scenario, we'll look at locations like YMCAs too. In fact, we're looking and having conversations with YMCAs right now, not necessarily for polling locations, but more along the lines of mail ballot drop-off locations. And as you can see here, the fact that we're doubling the total number of mail ballot drop-off locations for 4 times the amount of days than we did in any other given election tells you the extent in which this is being expanded. So this notion of, I see this more of a balance, and it's you know, I've used in the past that for the November's election, there's going to be limited options for in-person voting. Yes, in terms of the overall number of sites than there were during the March election or prior elections that we had, but know that we're going to be open for 4 times the amount of days to facilitate the election process across those 235 locations. So if there is any thinking that this is going to be this is not about cost. If anything, this is going to cost more money in this election than it ever has to be able to facilitate this election. To pivot like this normally would take 4 to 6 years. And in fact, that was the track that I was on, that if this was going to happen, if we were going to go to, if you will, option 3 here of the Voters' Choice Act, that it would take more of a 4 to 6 year cycle to be able to get there. Here, what we're having is more of a 4 to 6 month period of time for us to pivot and introduce this to ourselves, as well as implement it effectively for voters come election day. So all of, I believe that the satellite locations, not knowing that this pandemic was going to have, frankly, was beneficial for us to have done it. And at the time, it was really because of the party primary election and this new law called conditional voter registration happening all the way to the polling place level. With that experience, we're now porting that over to this model that we're conducting here. And so it's not really a Voters' Choice Act model that we're going to. And so please know that that's not what we're going towards here. This is a one-time November election that we're going to pivot to this, which is option 2 of the purple area that you see here. And the reason why there's differences is because in a Voters' Choice Act model, any voter can go to any respective location within that county. Here, voters will still be assigned a polling location to go to should they choose not to vote their mail ballot, or should they need to vote at the polling place because they're a person with a disability, or because they need a replacement ballot and they don't have enough time to ask another one from ourselves and for us to mail it out. So voters will still be assigned to a specific polling place. And frankly, for the November election, this is the best of all worlds, is for 2 reasons. One is because our voters in our county have historically known that they go to an assigned location to vote. It's on the back of the sample ballot pamphlet. It's something that they're used to doing. 2 is because the November's election and it's a presidential election, because it's the highest turnout election. And again, the past 4 presidential elections for November elections that we've ever conducted, the total turnout on average is 79.5% turnout, with the highest being the 84% turnout. And you've heard me say that before in my presentations, but the highest percentage turnout that we've ever experienced was in 2008's presidential general election, which is the at 84%. And in the last presidential election in 2016 was an 81.5% turnout. So with an average between the 4 presidential general elections that we conducted of recent of 79.5%. So I anticipate going into this November's election that it will be no less than 79.5% turnout, even when we have had an increase in the total number of registered voters, and we've added nearly 150 to 200,000 new registrants since the 2016 election. So as you can see, with assigning a person to a location, what that does from an administrative level is also ensures that there's not going to be huge spikes and deserts that are going to occur come election day. And so although these locations will be open for 4 days, again, as we've experienced and what we're anticipating and expecting for the November election is that on election day, we will see a huge spike of voters going to one of these respective super polls on election day to be served. And the fact that voters are assigned a specific location helps to distribute those voters across all the respective sites more evenly. And that's one of the lessons learned. One of the things that I've been tracking in the Voters' Choice Act model or vote center model is this notion of how have counties implement that and how difficult of a time did they have going through their respective election for the very first time. One of the reasons why I could never recommend it for a presidential general election, but are now having to force to blend that in with kind of a traditional / vote center model for this November's election as a result of the pandemic. So as I track it, if you look at 2016's, 2018's, 2020's election, you look at Salt Lake County, Utah, you look at the city and county of Denver that implemented it prior to 2016. You look at the state of Texas, like Harris County, or Dallas County, or Los Angeles County and Orange County, particularly in Los Angeles County, and Maricopa County that's out there in the 2018 election as well as the 2016 election. All these respective counties, when they implemented some degree of a vote center model, they had these deserts and spikes going on where one location had a huge number of people going to and had long lines. Other locations didn't have anywhere close to the long lines because not very many people went to them. So this notion of distributing voters out is key, like it is in a traditional polling model, to ensure that there's not going to be long waiting lines come election day. And so one of the things that we're anticipating, not knowing what to expect, is, and the only thing that we can look at is past historical data and keying off of concerns of the public health officials, elected officials talking about staying at home, voting your mail ballot, is how much of that will impact voters to vote their mail ballot as opposed to going to a polling location. In the 2016 presidential general election, we had approximately 500,000 voters still go to a polling place, even though the makeup at that point in time, I think, was in the mid 60% of people receiving a mail ballot. 500,000 people still went to a polling place and voted at their respective polling location or a location that was out there. For this upcoming election, that, by the way, that number, that 500,000, is the lowest it's been historically and has been going down every presidential election cycle. And so I anticipate that will certainly go down for this upcoming election, and particularly with the pandemic putting a little bit more fuel to individuals being more preferring to vote their mail ballot as opposed to going to an in-person site. We're going to encourage that they go to the A site as an alternative should they need to, and encourage them to vote their mail ballot. So what that will require us to have is approximately 3,500 poll workers. And the poll worker structure is going to change as well. So before, it was an individual signing up to be a poll worker. They get a stipend. They would show up individually to a poll worker training site. They would individually, when they go to poll worker training, they're going individually there and they're getting trained kind of in a classroom format. In the upcoming in this upcoming election, individuals won't be be provided a stipend. They would actually be given an hourly wage, and as opposed to doing it individually, they're going to be trained as a team per site. And the reason why is because we need to ensure that there's a level of continuity on day one when we launch on this on October 31st and open up the doors for at every single one of these 235 sites, that they know each other, that they know what their roles and responsibilities are, they know how to facilitate some of the new technologies that I'm going to be talking with you about, that they know what the new voter flows are going to look like when a voter comes comes to them and checks in, that they know how to use the respective personal protective equipment that we're going to be issuing, how to face specific situations when a person doesn't want to wear a mask or is there to observe and doesn't necessarily want to wear a mask. So all of this really means that for us is poll worker training is going to change. And although we're not going to need as many poll workers, we're going to need them for a longer duration of time. And the training is going to be much more comprehensive than it has been in the past, as opposed to a couple of hours worth of training on one day. At minimum, it's going to be a 2-day training, a day of setup, and then a 4-day work time frame at maximum during the life of when these 235 sites are going to be open. And then as you can see there, from a voter education campaign, we plan on having a robust voter education around Vote Safer San Diego and messaging it in a variety of different formats as we have done in the past. Okay, so let me talk with you a little bit about vote by mail in general. We are well positioned. I think it goes without saying that we have always been more recently and have poured a lot of resources in this area of mail ballot. It's been growing since 2004, the population of people wanting to vote by mail. And so our office is both from an inbound and outbound point of view, well positioned to address the 25% of remaining individuals that do not receive a mail ballot will now receive that mail ballot and be able to handle that. Our vendors are on board on that, as well as our ability to manage to that respective capacity. And certainly we've invested a lot of processes around efficiently and safely and securely processing all of the mail ballots when they get back to our office. We are purchasing new equipment. In fact, some of them will be coming at the latter part of next week as well as the following week, and that is our automated extractors. We purchased a total of 10 extractors. We piloted some of those out during the March election. We purchased 2 of those, and now we're going to expand that out to an additional 8 automated extractors, and that will also assist us with limiting the total number of individuals because of proximity of one another that has been historically been needed to facilitate the extraction of mail ballots after they have been verified and validated. So we're going to need to expand outside of our office. As large of a building as we may look like we have, it's not enough space with the total number of election workers, seasonal temporary staff that we are going to be bringing on board. We are actually looking outside of our building to do specific tasks like signature verifications. So there are already 3 conference rooms on campus here at the County Operations Center that we secured, and we're piping in data lines and computers so that way we can ensure physical distancing of our staff 6 feet away from each other so we can meet to that respective capacity over the lifetime of verifying mail ballots. One of the requirements as a result of Assembly Bill 860 is going to be this expansion and use of the remote accessible vote by mail system. I spoke about this during the March election where starting January 1st of 2020, people with disabilities and individuals, military and overseas voters had the ability to use a new system that all counties needed to have implemented, which is this remote accessible vote by mail system, where if you sign up for it, if you're a military and overseas voter or a person with disability for the March election, you had the ability to sign up and we would email you the ballot. You would mark your ballot on screen, print it out, and then mail it back to us or fax it back to us. That was, again, isolated to two populations, people with disabilities as well as for people that were military and overseas voters that were deployed. Now, as part of Assembly Bill 860, that is now expanded to all voters having the capability and ability to exercise this respective option. So voters can sign up and use this option if they need to. And the way I see this being used is, since we're going to know the set of registered voters that need to be mailed a ballot, it's not really for those voters unless they have somehow misplaced their mail ballot, they didn't receive their mail ballot, or they've mismarked their mail ballot and there's not sufficient time. Additionally, I see this being used by individuals that are registering well too late for us to really mail them a ballot because of the processing time of getting it data entered, sending that information to our mail house that compiles the mail ballot packages, and then of course sends it through the US Postal Service. I see individuals that are exercising, if you will, the conditional voter registration option, using this option to email them the ballot. That way they can receive it immediately in their email box, mark it, print it out, and then mailing it back to us or dropping off to any one of our mail ballot drop-off locations or polling places that we will have, super polls that we will have. Additionally, one of the things that the legislature did with Assembly Bill 860 is extended the time for us, expanded the time for us to process mail ballots. So right now, prior to AB 860, Assembly Bill 860 passing, we couldn't extract and tabulate, or not tabulate, but scan in ballots until the 14th day prior to an election. Now, as you can see here in this slide, this second to the last bullet point, we have the ability to do so as soon as we receive a mail ballot that's been returned back to our office, that we have always been able to process, that is, verify the signatures off the envelope, but extracting and scanning that ballot was only being able to be reserved for 14 days in advance. Now, we have essentially been able to immediately act upon that mail ballot as soon as we receive it. And then finally, the last item there is this notion that because of 100% of voters that are receiving a mail ballot, there needs to be additional time for us to, there could be a higher number of mail ballots that are postmarked on time, which is election day, but quite didn't make it to our office 3 days after election day. And so they expanded that time frame to an additional 14 days. So now, if a ballot is going to be postmarked on election day and it's been sent through the mail, and as long as we're receiving it 17 days after the election, no later than 17 days after election day, we can still accept that ballot and count it. So that is part of Senate Bill 423. And again, Senate Bill 423 hasn't passed yet, but it's urgent legislation, and I do not see that not passing. What in-person voting will look like, I've kind of verbally spoken with you about what that will look like, but let me kind of go into more of the bowels of what that will look like. So again, unlike a Voters' Choice Act model where anyone can go to any respective location, we'll still posture ourselves as if these are traditional polling locations where voters will still be assigned a specific polling location that they need to go to come election day or the 3 days leading up to election day. And again, as I mentioned, that we are assuming 700 ballot types. So each of these respective locations will have an, on average, number of 3 ballot types that they need to manage to. Right now, in a traditional polling location, each board, each set of poll workers are managing to 1 ballot type. So when a voter goes there, their roster of voters, their paper roster of voters that they would look up, they know that that person that's in there is able to vote the respective contests that they're assigned to, because they're only managing to 1 ballot type. On average now, for this upcoming election, our poll workers are going to need to manage to up to 3 or more ballot types, depending on the size of this threshold, this 1 for every 10,000 threshold that we're trying to, that we have to meet. Additionally, as opposed to a board, a makeup of 4 poll workers, the average number of poll workers that we're going to have at each respective site is 15 hourly paid poll workers that are out there. Again, just because we are sending everyone a mail ballot, because we're consolidating the total number of physical sites, that doesn't necessarily mean that we can forget about the surge and number of voters that we need to expect or anticipate that will go out to the respective locations, and to ensure that no one is going to stand in a lengthy line. So we will have, on average, 15 paid poll workers serving across those 4 days. It might be staggered on a Saturday and Sunday. We might not have all 15 on that Saturday and Sunday and or Monday, but certainly on election day, we'll have all 15 per site on average. The consolidated polling places, how are we going to manage the polling place if poll workers are going to need to manage to 3 ballot types? And how do we know which person is going to vote on which respective ballot type? Well, as opposed to a paper roster, what we have purchased, and we just got authorized to do so through the board, is to purchase 2,000 electronic poll books. These are essentially iPads that have software on it with the database of all registered voters within the county on it, and it has the disposition of everyone's mail ballot on it, as well as what ballot type this voter is going to be able to vote on. So to kind of describe the process, if you're a voter that is assigned to this respective location, I would look up and would show up at a table, and there's going to be 7 of these electronic poll books on average per site. And the poll workers would look up Anne. She'd fill out an application in advance of it, just a short form, show it to the poll worker. They'll look it up on the electronic poll book. It'll be quicker to find them. They'll know, as opposed to going through, active pages or inactive pages, or the blue pages, which are the more recent registered voters. These electronic poll books will be updated. And so there's no longer having to look at multiple pages or colored pages to find the voter. The person will come up, if they're a registered vote, their disposition of their mail ballot. If we receive their mail ballot back to our office and we've accepted it, then this person is going to, if they want to vote, they're going to need to vote provisionally. If they're a mail ballot voter but haven't returned their mail ballot back to us, then we can suspend that mail ballot and issue them a regular ballot. That means they don't need to vote a provisional ballot, okay? So this electronic poll book is somewhat of a game changer, because we don't see the total number of provisional ballots being cast as we've seen in a traditional polling place environment. And the reason why is because the majority of all provisionals that are cast are individuals that are mail ballot voters that could not surrender their polls on election day when they went to their respective polling location or to a polling location. And so these electronic poll books will make more efficient the process flow in which a person would go to a site. And lastly there, as you can see, is if a person happens to show up and goes to an unassigned polling location, we would still be able to serve them, because these electronic poll books would have the database of all registered voters. We will also know what ballot type that they're supposed to vote on. And as opposed to having a paper ballot for them that we could issue, an individual that would be voting doesn't necessarily need even to vote, that's going to their unassigned polling location, can still vote their respective contest. They would do so on the ballot marking devices that we will have there. In a traditional polling place, normally would have 1 accessible ballot marking device per polling place, per precinct. And now, for this upcoming election, we'll have approximately 7 to 8 of these ballot marking devices for people with disabilities and accessibility purposes, but also to manage to situations like this, so a voter does not necessarily need to vote provisionally. Again, one of the things that will help us administratively on the back end of processing these provisional ballots. Why haven't we done this in the past? Why didn't we introduce electronic poll books in the past? Let me just say, doing so, introducing technologies like this to 8,000 or 9,000 poll workers is a much heavier ask, and to do it right, than doing it in a more controlled environment where we're doing 235 in more of a team environment over multiple days. than we did in a traditional polling place. So we see this, frankly, as a great stepping stone of where this could look like in the future for us, not knowing what the future after November's election will look like, and how the legislature will posture, as well as certainly the Board of Supervisors. And I have to say, again, although we're building to all this infrastructure for in-person voting, our really push from a communication perspective will be about voting the mail ballot. So what will this look like conceptually for you? So this is the traditional polling place voting precinct model that you see here. It's the county, as you can see, cut up into many different boundaries based off of ballot types, based off of total number of registered voters, one for every 1,000 registered voters, as well as all the political boundaries that overlap the county. What will that look like in a consolidated polling place environment? That's what you're going to see here is that you're going to now see bigger chunks. And this is conceptual. Again, this is not what that you're ultimately going to see. And then once we know how we're going to consolidate them, then we're going to make the polling place assignments, which is this last map that you're seeing here. Is then we'll cite the 235 sites throughout the entire county and be strategic and thoughtful about where we need to place these respective sites, knowing that we're going to have not as many to choose from, because there's a finite number of public facilities that are out there that have large enough space, or any facilities, whether it's private or public space, that we can use throughout the entire county to really meet public health official and governor mandates and executive orders that are out there. Okay. All of this is going to have to come with a huge amount of voter education and communication out there. So we have and will be continuing to launch into a robust vote safer San Diego County communication plan. Some of this has already started with social media posts that we've done, and we'll hit all of the respective traditional as well as new media, like social media, Instagram, Facebook, as well as Twitter that's out there, but also work with news outlets and newspapers to get the message across, so we can really be comprehensive of all the different demographics that we need to consider for the upcoming election. And that really starts off with a countywide mailer that we've developed. You'll see that here in just a split second. That really points out to all these respective changes and more summarizes more concisely all of the changes that voters can expect in San Diego County. So this is what it looks like. So 90 days prior to election, so that's going to be this early August. So in a couple of weeks here, this is the mailer that we're going to be sending out. And inside that mailer, that's the front portion of it. Inside of it, we'll talk about things like 100% all voters will be mailed a ballot for the upcoming election. The fact that they can sign up for ballot tracking of their to and from through this system called Where's My Ballot, or Ballot Tracks is the vendor's name. And to answer some of the questions that we know that are out there is how will voters vote at, and will there be in-person voting locations that will polling places on election day? And the answer will be yes to those respective questions. And then also to urge and highly encourage voters to vote their mail ballot and get back to our office as the safer option to limit the spread, as well as to keep our poll workers and themselves and voters safe, unless it's really needed to vote in person. Additionally, part of the mailing will be to verify one's residence address, as well as their mailing address if there is one on file with our office. And that's what you see here. That's the variable data information. Why is that important? And why are we doing this 90 days in advance? The reason why it is very important is because we want to make sure that a voter is going to get their mail ballot the first time we send it out. And if a person has moved, or if they no longer have a mailing address, if there was one on file with our office, or they've added a mailing address to it, we want to make sure that it gets to them the first time out. And so this is really important to start talking about the fact that every mail ballot, everyone's going to receive a mail ballot, and to know that, hey, how does that tie in with what is on file with the Registrar of Voters Office? So now is the time to look at the Registrar of Voters website and to understand what residence address we have on file for you, or what mailing address we have on file with you. And certainly this will be in reinforcement that when we print this out and send it to every single registered voter. So all active registered voters will be receiving this mailer asking them to verify, and then also to be informed about what to expect for the upcoming election. And then finally, one of the other additions to this mailer that we did for March's election as well is to make the sample ballot more contactless. As opposed to receiving it in the mail, their sample ballot and voter information is to sign up to receive your sample ballot and voter information pamphlet electronically, because it'll be safer that way. It'll be you'll receive it sooner, and certainly from an environmental perspective, it's much more environmental as opposed to receiving a hard copy paperback, hard copy paper pamphlet. And if you do need a paper, you can certainly print out that portion of what you want before you go to a polling place or before you vote your official ballot when you receive it in the mail. And then 40 days out, we will send out the sample ballot and voter information pamphlet. That won't change. There's no changes there. We'll send it out to all those that request it, and then also email it to the approximately 100,000 people that have signed up to receive their sample ballot electronically, which again, they'll receive it sooner than those folks that are going to still receive it by paper. And then 29 days out, which is October 5th, voters will receive their mail ballot. And we're doing some changes to the package inside of it. We call it the wrap. And it's a set of information that wraps around their official ballot that is really going to be front and center, that they will view. And what will also be part of that mail ballot package is their I voted sticker, which will be part of the wrap. Again, the wrap is essentially a piece of paper with a bunch of various messages on it, the voter instructions, how to vote the ballot, their I voted sticker, the instructions about why they're receiving a mail ballot, wrapped around the official ballot that they will ultimately mark and return back to our office. Okay, and then we're leveraging the U.S. Postal Service. We're heavily working with the U.S. Postal Service to design our mailer, as well as the mail ballot package. There is a program. If you haven't signed up for it, I highly recommend that you do so. I signed up for multiple years now. It's called Informed Delivery, where the post office will send you an email daily, and it will be an image, and what will be embedded in that email will be an image of pieces of mail that will be found in your mailbox. So you can actually look at when you receive your mail ballot or your sample ballot pamphlet. As you can see there, this information is coming from the U.S. Postal Service, that you can see that there's approximately 636,000 individuals in San Diego County that have signed up to receive their in this informed delivery, this email that has an image of what mail that is going to be delivered to them into their mailbox. And then the other thing that we're going to be highly encouraging voters to do, as opposed to just simply using these mail ballot drop-off boxes that is part of our program for those 29 days, just know that, again, this is prepaid postage on the mail ballots, the fact that the I voted sticker is there, and that there are thousands of these U.S. postal boxes, these blue boxes, throughout the entire county that they can certainly use as well. That may be closer in proximity, closer to where they live. They could probably step outside their door and walk a distance to either their mailbox or to where they retrieve their mail and drop off their mail ballot as well. Why I put intelligent mail barcode on there is because this IMB is what we call it, is the way that we're going to be able to track a voter is going to be able to track the to and from of their mail ballot package getting to them, as well as their voted mail ballot back to our office. Okay, if there was one message I would leave all of you is at this point in time is to really communicate this as to friends, families, neighbors about the changes that we're introducing for the upcoming election. I think one of the concerns that I have is not so much as the mail ballot, because we're only talking about 25% more of the population that, the remaining 25% of the population that needs to receive this mail ballot. I think we can sufficiently cover that through mailers, through social media, and through just one-on-one conversations that are happening out there. Where I see the biggest shift and change certainly is the polling place environment and the changes that we're introducing for it. And so for us to be able to turn this Titanic on a dime related to polling places will require information being spread far and wide. And that really starts with the League of Women Voters of North County, but many more organizations that we plan on engaging to disperse and dispense all of this information, and all of the other ways that voters can get their information about the status of their mail ballot or whether or not we received it as well. Having said that, that is my presentation. I will be more than happy to take any respective questions that you may have.
Thank you, Michael. Let me read to you first of all. Well, first, I want to just say I am stunned and amazed at what you all are going to be going through to put this election in place, because it's, oh, Nancy, you have to start my picture, I guess, or maybe not. Never mind.
And you have to do that, and you have to do that from your own place. I was trying to do it. So just do start video at the bottom corner.
I did, and I'm getting a message that says you cannot start your video because the host has stopped it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's
Okay.
okay. I don't know that anybody has to see me except to verify that I'm reading the questions correctly. Anyway, I am deeply impressed with the thought that has gone into trying to cover this
I would love
unique situation for all of us. It's just, it's extraordinary. So ladies, I would like to start, and gentlemen.
Is there any to the left or not?
I'll check, but I won't be
If not, it's fine.
I'm hearing people. If you could all mute yourself, that would be good, because I am hearing background noise from some of you. Okay, so some people send in questions ahead of time, and the way this is going to work is I am going to ask the question. The machine thinks that I am going to answer the question. I am not going to answer the question. Michael is going to answer the question, but that's just the way the machine is set up. So you may ignore that and listen carefully.
Okay.
Okay, so Michael, first question. Ballot harvesting. What is it, and does it affect ballot counting?
So ballot harvesting is kind of a term that I generally stay away from in terms of using the word harvesting, because it's kind of a pejorative term. It makes it sound like there's something wrong around the process of collecting, what I call collecting and returning of mail ballots. I think it becomes an issue if a person who is collecting ballots is potentially misleading or fraudulently creating some type of fraudulent activity associated with it. But the fact that a person collects a ballot on behalf of an individual and returns that ballot, there's no harm or foul associated with it, unless there's some evil intent associated with what they're planning on doing, negative intent associated with it. But it has come as a result of, frankly, after the 2016, 2018 elections, and it really revolves around, at least in California, when Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez passed a bill that opened up the doors for more people to be able to return it, a mail ballot on behalf of another individual than a family member, and so forth. Are there potential concerns associated with it? Certainly, there's always concerns with anyone collecting a ballot and returning it. And for myself, I liken this similar to third parties who are registering voters to vote, register to vote. is that if there's any questions about who this person is that is trying to collect a ballot, whether it's a political party, whether it's a part of a campaign, or there's just a simple individual citizen that is going door to door, if there's any concerns associated with it, again, the direct way of approaching it is to send that mail ballot back to us either through the U.S. Postal Service or simply at one of our mail ballot drop-off locations where we have staffed individuals like the League of Women Voters there that are returning these mail ballots back to us and directly work with us. So I have not really seen all of the examples of individuals that are somehow fraudulently harvesting ballots and potentially changing people's votes or signing off on envelopes of what I've heard. Certainly, is that a possibility? Yes, that's a possibility. The question is what's the probabilities of that happening that is out there on any systemic level? And if that did occur, we would hear about it. I think our office is kind of the first avenue in which a voter would reach out to us to say, hey, this is happening. And if it did, we would touch base with the district attorney's office or the Secretary of State's office to address those respective concerns and to investigate them as well. I think the other side to this also is there's really not a need. I'm not really sure where the campaigns and political parties are at on this, but if there is an effort, so be it, because ultimately that concern really did not have to rest with Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez passing that respective law. It could have certainly occurred well before that law making that respective change in that law passing. And the reason why is because, certainly a person could have collected ballots and returned them, and we would have been none the wiser because they could have just dropped it off at a U.S. Postal Service box. I just have not heard that in any respective degree, and I think there's a couple of things associated with it. Again, a person signs their mail ballot envelope, and that's what we verify. And that's what we will be continue to verify it. And so that is, if you will, the linchpin of the safety nets around it. And as I mentioned before, if there's any concerns around any groups or organizations on any mass level of doing that, I would say to just work directly with our office. Again, I haven't really heard about it in the 2018 election or any efforts associated with it during 2018's election. Not to say that that might happen for 2020 elections, that there may be larger organization and groups of individuals that may be collecting ballots that are out there. But as I always say, similar to registration, just don't work through a third party, just send it back directly to our office.
Yeah, that does seem like the simple answer, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, next question you've already answered about how MBDO will be handled. Third question, when are California ballots counted? You've answered that for us. Okay, what has worked when doing voter registration and voter education during the pandemic? Do you have any experience with that yet?
I don't. I certainly, we haven't stopped processing registration forms, and I think individuals that are out there that are pushing voters to register to vote. Certainly there's been a lot of demonstration and protests as a result of the killing of George Floyd that's been out there. And as a result of that, this effort to get people to register to vote. But I think registering people to vote is so ubiquitous and so easy these days that people know, and maybe when it comes down to registering as opposed to voting, the registering is probably the easier of the two processes because it could be done so easily and remotely because of you just simply have to go to a computer, a laptop, a tablet, or even one's phones to get onto online and register to vote. So I don't really see an issue thus far along those lines about people registering to vote. And certainly our numbers have, as I mentioned before, our numbers have dramatically gone up since the 2016 presidential general election. I see that being pushed up slightly even more, but we're over 80%, I believe, of all of our registered voters are already registered to vote. 81%, wow. I believe, 81 or 82%, I think is the number.
That sounds good. It sounds very good. Okay, the next question, how will you get enough workers for polling places and for MBDO? Where are you recruiting?
Thank you. As I mentioned, as opposed to needing 7,000 to 8,000 or even upwards of 9,000, a pool of 9,000 poll workers, we're going to need around 3,500 to 3,600 poll workers that are paid. So to create that level of certainty and commitment, we're going to be paying everyone that signs up to be a poll worker an hourly wage. And to know that this is across multiple days as opposed to, one day and maybe some training hours. And I don't diminish that by any means. But now it's going to be for approximately a whole week that an individual is going to need to dedicate. So that's one area, is incentivizing by paying an individual an hourly wage across the total number of hours that they would spend helping our office out. We are looking at, because we need less individuals overall, we are looking and focusing our attention on precinct inspectors, those that have worked multiple elections for our office, field support representatives as well to our office. And then overarching to that is, as I mentioned, on average, there's going to be about 15 individuals that will be working at every single site. One of those individuals will be a site manager. They will be paid a higher level to manage the other 14 individuals as well as that respective site, to create levels and levels of organization as well as structure as to how the polling place will operate. And these individuals will be trained much over a matter of weeks as opposed to a couple of days. So that's what we're doing now. Our focus right now are the site managers, and there's going to be a little over 235 because we have to have some backups there. So that's what we're launching in now. And we've started not only recruiting those individuals, but have started the hiring process for those individuals because they will go through an interview process. So our poll worker recruitment staff has already launched into scheduling of interviews and bringing these individuals in to interview them, and to ultimately, if they meet the qualifications that we're looking at, to hire them, get them through a background process, and then get them paid and on board. The poll workers themselves, again, we'll hire them, and we believe that we'll incentivize that through paying them an hourly wage, and we'll use existing poll workers. And the focus on our existing poll workers are those individuals that have worked in multiple elections in the past, like our precinct inspector, touchscreen inspector, and assistant inspectors.
Okay, so here's our first written question from the audience here.
Anne,
yeah.
Can I just say one additional thing? One of the things that we're also looking at with our poll worker population, because the governor executive order called out the ability to have public employees serve as disaster service workers, we are looking at that option and having county employees be classified as disaster service workers for us. And so the thinking there is we would slot at minimum one county employee at every single one of the respective, and as many as two or more, depending on how many people sign up for that.
Great. That would keep a lot of people employed, I would think, during this difficult time.
Yep.
Okay, so an NPR analyst has found that in the primary elections held so far this year, at least 65,000 absentee or mail-in ballots have been rejected because they arrived past the deadline, often through no fault of the voter. Can the Registrar of Voters do anything to mitigate this concern?
Yes, I think not so much as the Registrar of Voters. I can talk with you about specifically the Registrar of Voters, but I think the state has already taken action. Again, it still has to be postmarked on election day. That hasn't really changed. That's a pivotal and deadline. There has to be a date certain on that. But as I mentioned before, is the legislature extended the period in which to accept them by an additional 14 days, as opposed to the Friday after election day. Now we can accept a ballot if it's postmarked upwards of 17 days after election day. So that's number one. Number two is those mail ballots that where a person has not signed their mail ballot but returned it on time, or we've deemed that signature is not matching. Now they have a longer period of time to cure their signature as well. And then thirdly, we're looking at options as to if something is not postmarked at a specific time frame where the person didn't date it according to the law, they didn't date it. We're looking at various technologies to see whether or not we could lift up based off of what the post office sprays onto that envelope to see if we can get information that tells us that that ballot was postmarked by election day for us to be able to count. And I also have to say is that other states, maybe with the exception of like Washington, Oregon, Utah, and Colorado, and maybe some other Western states, you know, we're much more mature as a state on how to handle, and our laws are there to manage around mail balloting. Whereas states like Georgia, Wisconsin, West Virginia still have these stringent, Alabama, Mississippi have these really stringent mail ballot laws. And now they have, frankly, are well behind the 8 ball in terms of even managing to capacities, and their laws may not be able to reflect some of these acceptance provisions of one's mail ballot. So I would say that 65,000, it may seem high, but I think that's more along the lines of from other states that really have not matured or do not have the benefits of what California does in our respective laws.
Okay, thank you. Will the social distancing required at schools impact your access to schools as public facilities? Schools are changing the way they are using their open spaces.
Yes, you know, this is yet to be known. We have sent out to all public facilities that we've identified that meets the spacing requirements. To a lot of them are schools, and so we are right now waiting to hear back from all of the schools as to whether or not we're able to use it. Now, the law cites that we have the ability to use it, but certainly we want to see what level of impact the request that we're making will have on them, particularly when we don't know how, and they may not know how they will ultimately have or not have kids going to school. I think it's kind of this moving target, and we, as I mentioned before, we can't live in that level of uncertainty, and so we are, you know, needing to get answers from the school districts. And I know the Secretary of State is working with the Superintendent of Public Schools to get answers, as well as to nudge this conversation that's out there as well. But if we can get the schools, we've already surveyed the site, so we already had it within our knowledge base, if you will, of which locations have more than or equal to 2,000 square feet in space to be able to distribute and position voting booths at least 6 feet apart from one another.
Okay. What constitutes an active voter?
So this is really, at the end of the day, on its face, it may sound like an active voter is a person that is constantly voting or is voting. And that's not necessarily really the case. According to the National Voter Registration Act, a voter is an active voter so long as they haven't had things like a piece of election material, mail, that has been returned back to us. So a person remains on active status until we receive some type of indication that the person no longer lives at that address. And generally that comes in the form of a piece of election mail being returned back to us undeliverable, like a mail ballot. If we send out a mail ballot to, 123 Sesame Street and it comes back to us, what that does is we place an inactive status on that voter, and we are required to send a confirmation notice, which is a forwardable postcard that tries to track that voter down for them to directly interact with us, a first-person interaction with us, to say, hey, what is your disposition? We have had some indication that you no longer live there because we had this return mail ballot or a return piece of mail come back to us. we place that voter on inactive status. If they fill it out and they say, no, I still live here, we keep them on active status. If they don't, if they say that they've moved and they no longer live at that residence address and now live somewhere else, we have the ability to now cancel them off of the voter registration rolls. If they don't respond at all to it, then we can now wait for a period of 2 federal general elections. And at that point in time, pursuant to the national, which is a federal law, the National Voter Registration Act, can cancel them off the rolls. So what that means, an active status is a person who effectively has not had any indication that they no longer live at that residence address. There's no indication that they no longer live at that residence address.
Right. Okay. Will voters have to go to a specific center based on address? I believe you've already told us that yes, they will.
They will. This, again, this is one of the other concerns. Again, we're anticipating around 350,000 individuals. Now, where we come with that number is more along the historical figures. So the last figure was 500,000 people voted during the 2016 election. That number has been going down. So when we factor the percentage of people that have historically been reduced as a result of preferring to vote by mail, as well as this pandemic, we're anticipating around 350,000 individuals going to a polling place. That's our numbers to go by. That's our best guess at this point in time, using data to the extent that we know. Ultimately, voter behavior will decide for itself of how many ultimately people go to a polling place on election day or the 3 days prior to that. We did not want to create a vote center model. Number one, we would have had gone to the board. There wouldn't have been sufficient time to be able to do that. As well, is because of the surge that we're expecting. And we don't want, for example, like if Anne worked at one location and she now is having 100 people showing up at her polling location, yet, we had Chris at another location and there's no one showing up, and it's because of where we cited these respective locations. Ultimately, we did not want to create a free-for-all system.
Right.
FFA is what I always call it. We needed to still have some structure to be able to administratively handle the election and to distribute the total number of voters that are out there.
You're going to love the next one, Michael. I just looked at the ROV website and the link to volunteer as a poll worker is not available. How do we sign up to be poll workers? Notice his grin. Look at that smile. That was his favorite question right there. Go ahead.
So Lisa, the reason, it's interesting that you just barely looked at that. And the reason why you did that is because my management team and I had a conversation just yesterday about our website and the fact that some of the information that we have currently on our website is misleading to voters as well as misleading to poll workers. One of the areas that we were misleading voters on is that they, we still had our old, not so much as old, it's still applicable if it was any other election than this one that we were going into, which is a person had to, if they wanted to request a mail ballot, well, everyone's going to be receiving a mail ballot. In the same respect, the poll worker application process has entirely changed. And so we're updating all that information, and we'll be posting new pages up soon, relatively soon, for voters who are interested in serving to sign up and apply as well. So be patient with us. That is coming.
I knew it was. I wasn't worried. Okay.
By the way, I think we just barely took down our sites, probably within the last 24 hours, that specific link.
Okay. How do you
at my request.
Yeah. How do you guarantee voter integrity and prevent voter fraud if mail ballots are accepted 17 days after Election Day?
For the same reasons that we are able to, that we accept in 3 days afterwards. I don't think it increases the likelihood of voter fraud one way or the other. Again, as I mentioned before, the signature is on that envelope, and that's what we're verifying against. And if there's any concerns or associated with it, then we would be interacting with that voter and addressing it with law enforcement bodies out there. But the voter has signed it. Again, we can't accept a mail ballot unless it's postmarked on Election Day or signed by, dated by that respective voters. And when it comes down to those mail ballots of which we're in possession of by 8 p.m. or those that we picked up from the U.S. Postal Service on election night, we know what that population is. And because we scan in and using our mail sorter to scan in all of those mail ballots on that day. So we already have a kind of this snapshot. So the only thing that could come through is through the U.S. Postal Service after that respective date, right? So, and it would come with a respective postmark, and we timestamp, date stamp when we received those mail ballots. So that's, there's, some, if you will, a record of when we received it and in where we received it from. We are purchasing, by the way, technology as well, even though it would be kind of a moot issue, but all of our mail ballot drop-off locations, we are purchasing software where we will scan in all mail ballots that are dropped off at any specific mail ballot drop-off location or any super poll site and scan them in so we know what mail ballots were dropped at that specific location on which date as well. But I don't think the days, the additional days somehow increases the likelihood of voter fraud happening because again, we only can pick up the mail ballots from a specific source, and that's the U.S. Postal Service.
Okay, is the electronic poll book connected to the internet? If not, how current will the database be?
So no, the answer to your question is the electronic poll books is, if you will, is connected. It's connected through a very secure channel directly to our system, and it's updated as well. So, but the electronic poll book is no way connected to the voting system itself. And it is a certified system by the Secretary of State's office. So the system and the electronic poll books that we will introduce has been vetted by the Secretary of State's office related to security and its use. So we couldn't even have selected the electronic poll book vendor that we are using had it not passed through the rigorous testing that the Secretary of State has. And it's, if you will, it's kind of a one-way, meaning we're pushing information to the system, and the only information that we would push back is potentially the only information that we would push towards our system would be what the kind of the status of their mail ballot. That's pretty much it. And it's in a very secured portal, so no one is going to be able to get into the system itself. Let me just also say that the database itself, let's say the system is let's say there is no connection to it. What will still reside on the tablet itself, this electronic poll book, will be the list of all registered voters. So we're not married to the connection as well.
All right, and Suzanne also would like to get her hands on the Voter Safe logo. She's our webmaster, one of our webmasters.
Be more than happy to send it, yes.
Okay, very good. Does fewer provisional ballots mean the count will be earlier?
Yes and no. I think it will have dramatic effects on the total amount of time that it checks provisionals. And I've always said provisional ballots takes probably, takes probably 5 times longer, maybe even longer than that, to check a provisional ballot than to verify a mail ballot. Because in a mail ballot situation, we know who we issued it to, and we know we can bring up that voter really quickly up into our voter registration system. Whereas a provisional voter, we don't know whether or not they're registered, whether or not they're able to vote that respective ballot that's inside of it. So there's a lot more handling of that provisional envelope. So yes, I believe that will make it much more quicker because of the reduction that I see that the electronic poll books will introduce. What will where there's going to be some net effect and balancing is how many more ballots are we going to receive closer to election day or on election day. And so there is some give and take. Ultimately, I think there is some more pluses than minuses in the ability for us to process the ballots post-election.
Okay, I may have missed this, but is it possible to drop completed ballots off at a polling place?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and many hundreds of thousands of people do that on election day. Not something that I encourage because I think there's mail ballot drop-off locations, because I think there are thousands of mailboxes that are out there. So, you know, I think voting, getting it back to us sooner rather than later is better. And again, I think the other side to this also is we're trying to limit the spread here. So the congregating of individuals at any given site. So can a person do so? Yes. And I anticipate tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people that will do that. But I hope that they won't, because they'll have already returned it in some other type of fashion, like a mail ballot drop-off location, or in advance to one of these polling locations the days leading up to Election Day.
Okay, Michael, let me ask you, do you have time to maybe take about 5 more questions? I
Yeah.
think we're getting close to the end. Okay.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
We'll speed it up for you because I know you have other things. Okay. Can we get the logo for personal use, like for Facebook, I don't know what. And then her second question is, she's telling us that the web page to apply as poll worker has been removed by you yesterday. And can we get the logo Vote Safe
Yep.
San Diego? Yes, yes.
Yes. We will be more than happy to provide you the respective logos that are out there.
Okay, what's the earliest we would hear about our possibly new polling place?
So we're in the process of solidifying them, I think, and we'll continue to do so. Part of the law is that we're going to need to publish these respective polling places as well as mail ballot drop-off locations. So we're being very thoughtful before we have to move towards publishing it. But right now, bottom line is we're trying to get consent to be able to use these respective locations. So by the time we send the sample ballot pamphlet, that's when you'll know what your assigned polling location is going to be, which is 40 days out. September, let's see here, that would be September 24th-ish. Around that time frame is when we'll start sending out the sample ballot and voter information pamphlets.
You know, your calendar is different from anybody else's private calendar, Michael. Okay, how is the ROV working on getting out the vote? Can we hope for a better than 80% turnout?
Yeah, if we can, frankly, if we can beat the 84% under my watch, I'll be ecstatic. I mean, I don't think 8% is when people are, frankly, the majority of public are very surprised that as large of a county as that we are, that we would have an 80% turnout. You've got like Los Angeles out there with 5 million registered voters, and there's around 69, maybe 70%. And we're beating them by about, a good 10 percentage points as large of a jurisdictions that we are. So that I think it relates to a couple of things. Mail balloting is one, as well as good, clean list maintenance practices that we have. Getting out the vote, I think, frankly, as I've always said, a person is more likely to vote their mail ballot if they have it in hand than not have it in hand, and then their only option is going to a polling place. Right. So I do believe that if there is going to be a time, this is probably a time where we could potentially see a higher increase in turnout. Having said that, there are a lot of other factors that comes into play with turnout. If it's a polling place like we would go into, weather is always a factor, but I don't think that's going to necessarily be the case this go around. But the contest itself, and particularly with the presidential election contest being on the ballot, we will ultimately see whether or not that is going to have a huge turnout on, if you will, both sides. I mean, I've never seen a situation where you were adamant or opposed to voting for or against a specific person or candidate out there. So I think that's going to be kind of a driving factor with it. From a measures point of view, right now we don't necessarily know all of the questions that are going to be on the ballot. Right now we have 5 local measures that we have in hand that have been submitted to us, and there's still time to pull that measure off the ballot because the 88th day, which is again August 7th is that deadline, can still pull a measure off the ballot. But and then you have 12 questions that are on the ballot. I don't know if there are any, really strong feelings about those respective questions on the ballot, but we will ultimately see. But generally, it's the contests that are on the ballot and campaigns that are trying to get out the vote, the GOTV efforts that are out there that will increase the overall turnout that is out there. But I think the mail ballots themselves will play a factor into it as well.
I'm sure you're right. Okay, How do you get a verified, meaning you, the Registrar of Voters, how do you get a verified signature when a person registers online?
Through the DMV. So, or by themselves. So if a person has a signature at the DMV and they give us their driver's license number, the system, the statewide voter registration system, tracks that person and then pulls down the signature from the DMV and then pushes it down to our office through the Secretary of State's system. If they do not have a signature on file, then that voter is asked to print out their registration form, sign it, and then send it back to us, of which then we'll scan and then attach it to their electronic record.
Okay, what do you think is the part of the voting process that LWV, that would be us, should focus on to make the most difference?
I think I would, I think it's where it's listed on the slide. It's going to be in stages. Veronica, I would say that, Ronnie, I would say that, I was like, Veronica, oh, well, hold on, that's Ronnie. So what I would say is right now, it would be, the message right now is, hey, make sure you have your residence address and mailing address, if you have one, on record with our office correctly. So double check that and know that this mailer that's going to go out to them. Once that mailer is out, then I think it's going to be this next pitch, which is, hey, you're going to get a mail ballot. I highly encourage you to vote that mail ballot. And here's the reasons why. Because of the pandemic, there are changes in polling locations that are out there if you're planning on going to a polling location still, which is totally fine. But know that there's a health and well-being that we need to be considerate of each other from a community level of stopping the spread of it and creating any level of spike as a result of the election. And then, so I would think that those would be the three messages, and it all relates to the communication of at least from my perspective, how the election will be handled and conducted.
Okay, so how do newbies get involved? I'm not sure what a newbie is.
You know, you're not a newbie, Anne.
No, I know I'm not, but she isn't either.
I think it's trying to, you know, I think there's going to be individuals that want to be engaged, and how do we, if there is energy behind all the things that are happening out there in the world, in our country, how do these individuals get involved, whether it's young folks or people that just have not been engaged in the past. For us, I think for the most part, I think it's what you're already doing. If you're a newbie, is getting registered first. If you have never participated, again, the person that asked the question about how do we get the other people involved, the 20% that are not registered or have not voted, get them registered and vote, and then maybe inching into things like participating with the League of Women Voters and becoming informed. I think probably for me is just the fact of being informed about what contests are on the ballot and taking the time out is not even, it's not the simplest thing, the next simplest thing that you can do, because I think it's just ultimately the more responsible approach to doing it. Now, if you want to get involved with our specific office, I would say, yes, check our website, sign up to be either a site manager if you have the qualifications, or to become a poll worker. Again, although our effort and our focus is on individuals that have participated and have served in a poll worker capacity in multiple elections, that's not to say that there are so many different other qualified individuals that should participate with our election, because they will probably provide other strengths than this knowledge of issuing ballots and how to interact with voters. So I would ask them to sign up with our office or work for our office. We go from a staff of 60 to 70 permanent staff members to 1,200 individuals. So if there was a time, if there is a high unemployment out there, there's definitely an opportunity for people to get involved, but also get paid to get involved as well.
Okay, what type of training will be provided for MBDO monitors?
So because of social distancing that's going to be out there, we are looking at how to create that environment. We're looking at things like Zoom, online training as well. We haven't nailed that quite down yet, but what we are looking at is still in-person a training that will be going on, just to make sure that that there's a level of awareness. I think, by the way, on this whole ballot harvesting and conversation that's out there, many locations are purchasing and working to have mail ballot drop-off boxes. We have never gone down that path, and we're not going to go down that path for this upcoming election. And the reason why is because, again, this is only for this election. All these changes are for this one election. We don't want to look past the election itself and recognize that. Plus, we just probably don't have enough procurement time and permitting time to try to figure out where all of these are going to be placed and get the permits to be able to, bolt these down into the concrete across the entire county. Plus, there is this personal security factor that I want to make sure that we're balancing out, where a person has the benefits of having a live person to drop off their mail ballot inside this box with staff or
Right.
of our office to look to make sure that they've signed the envelope, that they've done everything they needed to do before dropping it off into the mail ballot to the mail ballot drop off location, as well as it provides a level of security around it as well. The kind of a mental record by individuals that would work for our office if there is any potential fraudulent activity that may occur out there. Again, I don't necessarily see it, but if there was, this mitigates some degree of that.
Okay, now Trish has gotten for everybody 2 incredibly complex sites where you can find out. It's $20 an hour. And then
Yep.
down here, she has the poll worker job application. And let me just tell you all that Nancy is recording this, and you will have access to this if you want to look that up. Or we can have Trish just send us all the link. Okay, so somebody else would, I'm just not going to have you go through that, Michael. And here's the next one. What is the deadline date for registering?
So, that's an interesting, it's an interesting question. The actual date is October 19th is the deadline. Now, having said that, the reason why I'm kind of qualifying it is because there was conversation early in the hunt when we were talking at the very beginning, like right after the March election, and the legislature was contemplating, and task force were being put together, and election officials talking about potentially moving that deadline closer to election day. The most recent amendments that was just published still has the date as being 15 days in advance of election day. So again, this October 19th timeframe. So I think the issue is dead in terms of changing that respective date. But if it isn't, it could change out there. So right now it's October 19th, unless you hear otherwise.
Unless it changes. Okay.
It's always 15 days in advance of election day. 15 days in advance of election day.
Okay. I live in a 55+ community and would love to post this information at our mail center. Are posters available?
We absolutely can provide you posters. If I know which information, I'm sure you'll probably want just kind of a succinct poster of all of this information. Yes, we can provide that to you.
Thank you. Okay, since you are allowing so many days to receive mail-in ballots, how will that affect the final tally of who and what won the election?
I don't think it's going to impact us too greatly. Here's the reason why: is although so from a U.S. Postal Service point of view, mail ballots that come to us 3 days after election day is the bulk of anything that comes on the day after, or the day after that, or the day after that. So those 3 days after election day is when the bulk of any mail ballots that come to our office are going to have that postmark and be timely in terms of the receipt. So that postmark is key. because what we've also been tracking is how many mail ballots have come after the third day that are not postmarked timely, right? And so that number drops pretty dramatically in terms of timely postmarks, okay? So by the time it stretches out 17 days, the majority of all those mail ballots that would be coming through the U.S. Postal Service will probably not be postmarked by election day, okay? Now, where it could impact us in terms of a very close contest is any ability for a mail ballot voter who has had their ballot challenged because their signatures doesn't match or because they didn't sign it. You know, those might be floating out there as well. I don't see very many of those, but if it depends on how close the contest is, and if it's that close, as I've always said, it might go all the way till the date that we certify the election before we know who is the winner and the loser in the actual outcome of the election. And frankly, from my point of view, nothing's done until I certify the election. So regardless of the disparity in gap between candidate A and candidate B, or measure A, the yesers or no for a specific measure.
Okay, Suzanne is doing some PR for us. So we're going to go right on down to this question. And this may be our last question, Michael.
Okay.
Can you talk a bit about signature verification? For example, it must match exactly to the signature on file is what it says on your document. Does that include middle initials, nicknames? Is the mailing label an example of the official signature requirement?
So the answer is no. It simply is, it does not have to match exactly. And frankly, many people don't remember how they signed when they originally registered to vote. And certainly that has changed over time as well. So the answer is no. If we're looking at multiple criteria when we're looking at signature verification, we can use a combination of automation as well as manual review of signatures as we escalate the signatures. Just because we may challenge the initial person that's reviewing it, challenges a signature, that doesn't mean that we're going to challenge it for in perpetuity or now trigger a notice to be sent out to the voter. We escalate it through multiple channels before we get to this point of not counting the mail ballot or having to send that notice. And we're looking at if a person signs, let's say, their first initial, the initial of their first name, and then the last, spell out their last name, we'll accept it still, even though their signature on file has both their first name spelled out as well as their last name. So we'll look at variations as well. A lot of it is curvatures that we look at. Additionally, let me just say that the elections code, California's election code, has a liberal construction of the law per view. We liberally construe in favor of the voter. So that is our requirement, is that when we look at a signature, we're looking at the signature and basing a decision and siding with the voter's signature as opposed to count it, then not counting that mail ballot based off of it. So we're looking at a number of things like the signatures. We're looking at not just the signature off of the registration form, but past signatures from other registration forms. We're looking at how they filled out their registration form as well. So there are a number of different factors, and it does not look that we're not just simply looking at the most recent signature on their registration form. There's one more thing I wanted to mention. I just lost my train of thought associated with the signature as well. So maybe I'll get back to that if I recall.
Okay, and Michael, I have a question for you. I've had people ask in the past month or so, we've been hearing that the post office might get defunded, and that would mean within, I think somebody said somewhere 3 months, within 3 months of that, there would be no postal service. Which, do you know anything about that situation? That just seems so unlikely to me.
Uh, yes, and I have to say a couple of things. This is not the first time that I've heard this storyline, and not to say that this storyline will be different, but this came up during the 2016 election. It came up during the 2012 election. It came up during the 2018 election about the viability of the U.S. Postal Service, and we have a very close relationship with the U.S. Postal Service, and they have given me no indication that they're going to go under in between now and the election. I just don't think it would be a tenable situation on knowing that we have a national election.
Exactly.
And let me just also say, not just for the ballot themselves, but let me just say that going back to the National Voter Registration Act and the ability to conduct election, is not a matter of issuing a ballot, but it really starts with what registered voters we have on our file. And as I explained before, the National Voter Registration Act, how do we maintain our voter registration file? A good portion of how we conduct list maintenance of our voter registration file is through the U.S. Postal Service information, the national change of address information that we receive from them. So there is a lot more tentacles tied with the U.S. Postal Service than just ballots. It goes to the core of the other half of the equation, which is the registration database and the maintenance of that voter registration database. And I would say that's not just for San Diego, but across the entire country as well. So again, I have no indication, frankly, I'm confident that the U.S. Postal Service will be there for the duration as well as for the November election. Where I see some concerns, though, is our military and overseas voters because of the pandemic, where countries are shutting down their mail system. And so I think about our military and overseas voters, where there are countries out there, because of trying to reduce the spread and the availability, some folks are quarantining. The mandate is that you have to quarantine yourself. Unlike here in the United States, folks are having to stay at home unless they are needing to get things like food. And their ability to get things like even mail may be disturbed as a result of it. So we are looking at that. I know the Secretary of State's office is that I am on a national task force related to federal voting and the federal voting assistance program, particularly for military and overseas voters. And so they have come up with a number of recommendations for states to consider. But at the end of the day, it's up to each state on whether or not they're going to take some of those recommendations or not.
Okay, thank you. I will share that with all who ask. So now I want to thank you very much for coming. You have really been, I think it's disconcerting to talk to a bunch of little rectangular boxes with names on them, but you did that very well, and I really appreciate it. Thank you on behalf of all of us. Don't forget to send us your PowerPoint and
The logo.
And we are going to try and post that on our website so that people can hear, the public will be able to hear what you have told us. I don't think any of it is top secret, but good information the public might be interested in.
Yeah, I would say this is probably, I know that I did another League of Women, a couple of women voters presentation a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, the San Diego chapter. And so, yeah, all of you are kind of, for the most part, the first to kind of hear how we will approach the election. And we've kind of been in a shell trying to figure it all out before we go public on it. And so this is what we're doing now. And so stay tuned. More information is coming your way. And maybe what we'll do is again, as opposed to the league hosting it, we'll push to host to, again, continue this dialogue and this communication to really informing everyone that's out there. And I apologize, Elizabeth, but if I remember that's what I was wanting to say about the signature verification, I will certainly do that. I just can't remember what it was, and it's driving me crazy right now. So.
Okay, it's okay. Thank you. Is there anything else you want us to know, or anything I will tell you that we are working with the San Diego League. We would like to amplify your message, and we will be working with you. We have some professionals who are going to help us look at what we can do to amplify your message. Although I
Thank you.
think you do a really good job of messaging when you're on target, and you're working. Yeah. Okay, good.
you.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
right.
everybody, for coming.
Thank you,
I really
everyone. If you have
appreciate
any
it.
questions, feel free to call me or email me.
All right, will do.
Okay. Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
Michael.
Bye-bye
Thank
now.
you.
Be safe.
Bye. You
Bye.
too. Be safe, everyone. Be careful. Take care of yourself. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Ann. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Michael.